What we're going to talk about for the rest of chapter 10 is tools that help us deliver code more quickly through not just processes, but through how we work as a team. And so the first part of this is going to be what we call continuous integration. So the idea here, right, is that as we work on a backlog, we have a bunch of stories that have been prioritized that we know that are going to hopefully be implemented in the near future. The size of your backlog as a team, of course, might change over time. But at the start of an iteration, we have an iteration planning meeting to pick the features that will develop in that iteration. We've already got a shared GitHub repo. And what we hope has happened at this point in our development cycle is that this repo is set up and linked to a tool that we typically call continuous integration. If you've used GitHub Actions before, GitHub Actions are a continuous integration platform. There are others. Travis CI is one that used to be pretty popular, still is, but it's not as free anymore. So GitHub Actions is built right in. And the idea here is that, as we develop features, we'll have tools to help test them and deploy them. Optionally, you might have what you call a staging server hooked up for your app, which is somewhere that is a production server, so not your development machine, but a live URL that you can use to test the app in a closest to production as possible environment. It might have a copy of the production data. It might have it might be old production data. It might be anonymized data, but something that should give you a sense for, hey, this app is real. Once all that's set up, then you start developing your individual stories and hopefully testing them. So we've been talking about Git and workflows. And so in this model, it's helpful to think about sort of what exists and what's there. Remember, as we go from the left to the right, time goes on here. We have a team repo, which we can think of as sort of being the version hosted on GitHub or wherever else. And then you have your own copy on your machine. So this repo down here you should think of it as not necessarily a fork, but your own local working copy of the repo. So as you start a feature, you make sure that you check out a copy. That copy, you then start making a branch for each of your features. So we're going to be doing branch per feature here. As you work, you're going to make commits on a particular branch. When something is ready, you can push that branch to GitHub. And the chart here, notably where these sort of CI bubbles show up, is suggesting that when you push something to GitHub, you don't automatically necessarily have to open a pull request. You don't necessarily have to involve your teammates in the process yet. That could happen later, and we'll show what happens when you do get teammates in. What you want to happen is when you push your code, there's two useful reasons for this. The first simple reason is that pushing your code to GitHub or whatever your source control is hosted acts as a backup. No one likes to think about this, but your laptop could die or could be stolen or, something could just get corrupted. And so having a backup of your work is always valuable. But the second really important reason is that once something gets to GitHub and it's configured correctly, GitHub will trigger a run of continuous integration. What that means is all of your test cases that you've set up and have been hopefully using locally will also happen on a server. And the useful thing that comes back of this that we'll take a look at is the report that shows you the results of those test cases. And importantly, the nice thing is while you're working, you might be focusing on a specific model controller, something like that. Your CI test cases should hopefully exercise every single thing in the app. They might also calculate code coverage. They might do things like save screenshots for debugging later on and so on. As you keep working, you keep pushing more and more. And as you get ready to, let's say, make a pull request on GitHub, this allows your team members to view the results of those test cases and to review your code. So as you step through the process and you get closer, having a shared environment like GitHub Actions lets your teammates see, what is the status of those test cases. It could be tests, it could be code quality metrics. It's anything that your team sort of sets up. Perhaps in that process, you notice a particular test case failure, and CI could be the tool to catch that. It could be feedback from code review. So you go back to your local copy, make any fixes and push those. And now, hopefully, as you're getting close to finishing the feature, you have the opportunity to push it to a staging server. And this is the place where, depending on your specific team's workflow, the customer, hopefully, whether that is an internal or an external customer, has an opportunity to use the feature and give feedback on the feature. So some people call this user acceptance testing as a form of, if Cucumber are acceptance tests, user acceptance testing is the user going through and testing a version of the app. And this catches any feedback, any sort of fixes that might be necessary before going out to production. If everything is good, then you could sort of automatically, or depending on the team manually, say, all right, users have accepted this feature, we deploy it to production. And of course, in this simple cycle, there's only a few sort of steps here. This could be as long or as short as you need it to be in terms of the feature. But overall, hopefully, what you're doing here is iterating on code pretty quickly, pushing that code to GitHub, getting feedback from both tools and teammates, and then as quickly as possible as well, getting feedback from the customer. The quicker and earlier in the process that you catch an issue, the easier it is to resolve that issue. Once code is sort of committed and in a code base, going back and changing that code gets increasingly difficult. How would we think about stories as they relate to Pivotal Tracker and the workflow that exists? There's no one hard and fast rule for a team, but what's important is that within a team, you understand sort of where those stories stand. So typically in Pivotal Tracker, a story needs to be started. So we usually think about this as the second you make a branch that you start working on code, you start that feature. At the point in which you might sort of deploy the code to push the code to GitHub, make a pull request, that's often when people consider it finished, which is to say, I've done a round of testing. Note here that this is sort of after the very first or second round of sort of CI running, but you are now confident as an engineer that this thing is finished and ready. And when you think it's finished, then you typically go in and get feedback from your teammates, from, if it's your engineering manager, the final round of sign off, whatever it might be. And sometimes you'll say that it's finished and you find a fix that needs to be made. You get a code review comment on your pull request, whatever it might be. But at the point that you officially sort of say, all right, this thing is done, I'm going to push it to staging, that's when a lot of teams will say a feature is delivered. And then at that point, once it is in production, once the customer has sort of signed off, then you would say the story has been accepted. And remember that in the workflow that we've been talking about with stories and with Agile, these aren't the only 4 states that a story can be in. They're not the only 4 states that exist in Agile. But thinking about, especially at the end, the distinction between a story being delivered and a story being accepted. The customer is the one who determines whether or not a story is accepted. And so that means they have to be the one to sign off on it. Some teams will choose to say that accepted is only in production. Some teams will choose to say that accepted is a final round of staging testing. That really depends on your particular team dynamics. What's right is based on how you're able to work. If you're at a larger company who can only deploy at a certain particular window for whatever reason, you might say that staging counts as acceptance because the customers know at that point the feature is done. It will be in production soon enough. But some companies say that production is the means of acceptance, and it really just depends on your particular team. That's if you have access to the repo. If you're working on a team, you might sort of ask, well, in this GitHub model, right, we can fork repos and make our own team's copy or an individual copy on GitHub and then work on a local machine. Really, the process doesn't change too much in that you start with one additional level, which is to say, whenever that fork is made, you then create your team's repo. And at the end, you might still do testing in a staging environment from your team's fork. And you might then merge all of your code on your individual feature branch into your team's fork. And at the end, you get sort of a final step of making a pull request back to the original fork. This sort of depends, right, on your particular goals of the project. But it's really to say that if you introduce one extra level of fork repo from a different source on GitHub versus working on a local team, you really don't change the process much except your sort of initial and last steps that along the way, our development model should be hopefully flexible. So the trick in all of this is to improve the speed at which we iterate on by minimizing the loops and rounds of feedback that we need to go through. So as we've said before, small stories are your friend. Small stories are great because they lead to branches, which are simple and short-lived. They hopefully lead to fewer lines of code being changed, which leads to pull requests, which can be more quickly reviewed. And if things can be more quickly reviewed, they can go into production a little bit easier as well. The goal here, right, is to respect your team's work. Try to have a shared definition of what the priority of stories are, and to respect that order such that, if you know that a feature has some dependency on another feature being built, make sure you're helping the team as a team get features out in the right order. It seems a little bit obvious to say that you should respect your team's work and priorities, but when it comes to resolving things like Git conflicts, understanding that development priority and the order in which code might get merged in makes your lives and your teammates' lives easier. This one can sometimes be really hard to follow, especially if you're working on projects as a hobbyist or you're working on something part-time, but really try to work on one story at a time, which is to say that when you start working, focus on that particular story, work through a full iteration cycle of checking out a branch, committing a branch, testing, getting CI feedback, and try to do that one at a time because that minimizes the overhead of switching branches, Git conflicts, and really it minimizes the chance that not necessarily that something goes totally wrong, but that you just make simple mistakes that cost time. So what do you do if you discover that a story ends up blocking another? That's where you have a conversation, right, with your team, potentially refactoring, potentially, depending on the story, you could say, all right, well, if my teammate and I were working on two different stories, but their story is blocking mine, maybe we pair on the original story, get it done a little bit more quickly, and then we go back to individually working on stories. It always depends on the particular feature. One other important way to help sort of minimize extra loops and sort of iteration time is to continually try to work at a sustainable pace. Your goal should not be, right, to commit all the code on Friday before you go off for the weekend because you had a deadline on Friday. Again, seems a little bit obvious in retrospect, but it's really easy to feel like you have a whole week to get a feature out and not realize that really a lot of the hard work comes at the end of that cycle when you're trying to make sure that your teammates, your managers, your customers all have signed off on the right features.